Hey guys, since I'm not going to be there today, I'm going to go through the whole lesson with you. So turn your book to page 501. Today we are going to learn how to estimate fraction sums and differences. This is really no different than when we estimated if the fraction is closer to a half, a whole, or a zero. Let's practice. Number 1. We have to estimate 5/8 plus 8/10. Now they have different denominators, so you cannot add them. If I look at 5/8, I know that 4/8 is going to be a half. So this one is close to a half. Looking at 8/10, I know that 10/10 is a whole. And since 8/10 is close to 10/10, I know that 8/10 is going to be close to 1. So my answer for this one is going to be about 1.5. All right, now let's look at number 2. If I look at number 2, I see 1/8. And I know that 4/8 is going to be a half, 8/8 is going to be a whole, and 0/8 is going to be 0. Since 1 is closest to 0, 1/8 is going to round to 0. If I use the number line over here, the eighths, I'm going to look at this eighths number line right here. I know that 1/8 is going to be closer to 0 because I'm going to mark 1/8 on the number line right here where I marked it in green. And I have to think, is 1/8 going to be closer to 0, 1 whole, which would be 8/8, or 4/8? And if I can see it, I can see that it's closer to 0, and that's how I'm getting 0. Same with 1/5. If I mark 1/5 on the number line, I know that it's going to be closest to 0. So with 1/5, that one is also going to be 0. Whoops, let me change the color for you so you can see it. And 1/10 over here is also going to be closer to 0. So this one is just going to round to 0. All right, now we have 7/8 minus 1/10. Looking at 7/8, I know that 8/8, I'm going to use a different color right here. 8/8 would be 1 whole. And since 7/8 is closer to 1 whole because 4/8 would be a half, so and 0/8 would be 0, it is going to be closer to 1 whole. Minus 1/10, which I've already marked over here, 1/10 is going to be closer to 0 because 5/10 is a half. So now we have 1 minus 0 would just equal 1. Looking at number 4, I'm going to look at my tenths number line, and I'm going to highlight in green for you. I have 9/10. Well, knowing what I know about tenths, 10/10 is a whole. 5/10 would be a half. So 9/10 is going to be closer to 1 whole than to 1 half. So we have 1 minus, and 5/8, well, I know 4/8 is a half, so 5/8 is going to be closest to half. So we have 1 minus a half is just going to equal 1/2. For each fraction that you have, decide if it's closest to 0, 1/2, or 1 whole, then just round it to estimate. Go ahead and turn to the next page in your book. You should be on page 502. All right, we're going to continue with estimating fractions. Remember that when you estimate a fraction, decide if the fraction is closest to 0, 1/2, or 1 whole. Use what you know about fractions to determine. Are the following statements reasonable? Together, Randy and Martha bought about 1 pound of nuts. Fauna bought about 1/4 pound less than Chuck. All right, let's look at the bubble first. It says, you can use whole numbers and benchmark fractions, such as 1/4 and 1/2, to decide if a fraction sum or difference is reasonable. Over here, we have Randy has 2/3, Martha has 1/5, Chuck has 9/10, and Fana has 1/4. B, is 2/3 plus 1/5 about 1? Well, if we look at this number line, it's separated into 4 equal parts. It tells us here that 2/3 is close to 3/4, and we can see that on the number line if it was marked into 3 different parts rather than 4. I would say that 2/3 is close to a half. I would use a half, but it's actually right in between 1/2 and 3/4. And 1/5 is closer to 0. But if we add those two together, we are going to get that it is about 1. So if we look right here, it says think that 2/3 is close to but less than 3/4. Think that 1/5 is close to but less than a half. So when we round them, we get too close to 1. So this statement is reasonable. On our test and on the work that we're going to do today, you don't have to worry about rounding to 1/4 or 3/4. Just worry about rounding to 0, 1/2, or 1. Let's look at part C. It says, is 9/10 minus 1/4 about 1/4? So if we look at our number line right here, we know that 9/10 is close to 1. So think that 9/10 is close to, but you know it's a little bit less than 1. And we have 1/4. We know 1/4 is a benchmark fraction. So we have 1 minus a fourth is 3/4. So 9/10 minus 1/4 is close to, but not less than 3/4. So this statement is not reasonable. Like I said, don't worry about rounding to 1/4 or 3/4. We're really going to focus on rounding fractions to 0, 1/2, or 1/2. Look at the bottom of the page where it says convince me. Cammie said each of these pies is about a half, so if I put them together, I have a whole pie. Do you agree with this reasoning? Well, no, I do not agree, because if I look at the pies, this one is smaller than this one. So if I put them together, I will have more than half, but I will not have a whole because they are not the same size. Before we go on to the guided practice, I want to do a little bit of practice with you to help you decide if a fraction is closest to 0, 1/2, or 1/2. So I'm going to draw a number line. Turn this. Okay, I'm going to draw a number line. Here I have 0, here I have 1/2, and here I have 1/2. Okay, I'm going to list some fractions, and we're going to decide together whether the fraction is closer to 0, 1/2, or 1/2. All right, let's look at 2/4. I know that 2 is half of 4, therefore 2/4 is going to be closest to 1/2. Now let's look at 5/6. I know that since 6/6 is a whole, then 5/6 is going to be closer to 1 than it is going to be then to 0 or 1/2. Looking at 4/10. Look at the fraction. What's half of 10? 5. Since 5 is half of 10 and 4 is just 1 less, this one is going to be closest to a half. 7/8. If I have 7/8, I know 8/8 is a whole. Therefore, 7/8 is going to be closer to a whole. And now that brings me to 2/10. 5/10 would be a whole, 5/10 would be a half, and 10/10 would be a whole. 2 is a little bit far from 5, so 2/10 is actually going to be closer to 0. You may end up with a fraction like 6/10. If I look at 6/10, I know that 5/10 is half, so 6/10 is going to be closest to half. So use what you know about fractions to help you determine. If you get stuck, don't worry, I will be there tomorrow to help. Let's see if you are starting to understand. Use benchmark fractions to estimate 4/10 plus 3/8. Well, I know that 5/10 is half, and 4/10 is close to 5/10, so I have half plus, now I have 3/8. I know 4/8 is half, so that is also going to be close to half. So 1/2 plus 1/2 is going to equal 1. Make sure you write this sentence down in your notes. 4/10 is close to 5/10, which is half, and 3/8 is close to 4/8, which is half. Therefore, 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1 whole. And this should go right over here. All right, number 2. Charlie said 10/8 minus 1/5 is about 1/4. Do you agree? Explain. Guess what? You can skip this problem. All right, let's look at, it says 3 through 6, use greater than or less than to complete the equation. So I have 1 on number 3. I have 1/3 plus 1/2. Is it going to be greater or less than 1? Well, I know that 1/3 is closer to 0 and 1/2 is just half. So this is going to be, 1 is going to be greater, or it is going to be less than 1. 5/4 is greater than 1, and 2/4 is a half. So this one would be closer to 1 1/2. So 2 is going to be greater. 3/4 minus 1/8. Well, 3/4 is closer to 1, and 1/8 is closer to 0. So this one is going to be greater than a half. And then I have 3/2, which is 1 minus 1/4. 3/2 is going to be greater than 1 minus 1/4, so it's going to also be greater than a half. Do the rest of the problems on page 503, and then I'm going to assign a video called Another Look and the Practice Buddy. Go ahead and do all of that before you check your work with a partner, and then go back and check your work on page 503 and see if you want to change any of your answers. I am not giving you homework tonight except fact practice, and I will go over all of this with you tomorrow.